Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you here. Thanks for joining us this morning. I would like to open up with prayer, and then we're going to dive into, as we've been this journey through the book of Luke, and picking out some of the highlights, some of the stops along the way as we try to get through this book. So just for you to bow your heads with me. Father God, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for people that were inspired to write down an account that we could be learn how to live this life. We learn how much you love us, learn about your glory and your ways and your will for our lives. Just open up our minds and our hearts this morning. In your son's name. Amen. Okay. There was a young preacher who had graduated from Bible college, fresh out of Bible college, and he was invited to speak at his home congregation, like going back home, and kind of intimidating, go back to your home church. So he wanted to make a good impression, So he did his best to prepare to preach this sermon, and he wrote the sermon, word for word. He had it memorized and practiced it, and so he got up behind the pulpit and So he hit the pulpit really hard and began this sermon that he prepared. He's like, Jesus took 5,000 fishes and 2,000 loaves, and he fed 5 people. And the crowd responded like that. But he pointed his finger to the congregation and said, "Could you do that?" And everybody just roared with laughter. And he couldn't understand what was going on. And he was getting frustrated. He'd practiced and wasn't the response he was looking for. And finally, one man raised his hand and stood up and began to explain some mistake that he had been made. And the preacher, he was just so humiliated and discouraged. He just couldn't even finish the sermon. He just had sat down and just torn up. But it was his home church. They were loving and supportive of him. And, they just all gathered around him and encouraged him just to, come back next week. Preach this sermon next week. Go home. Take this week to study and to practice and just come back next week. And so that's what he did. After working on it for another entire week, he stood up in front of the congregation. At this time, started out the very same way. It says, Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he fed 5,000 people. Could you do that? And the same man raised his hand, and he's like, "Sir, how can you claim to do something like that, something that only God can do?" And the man said, "With the leftovers from the sermon last Sunday." So, today we're going to talk about the feeding of the 5,000. This is the only miracle of Jesus that's found in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have this account, very similar in almost all of their details of this account. So it's the only thing that we find in all 4 Gospels like that. And so on trivia night, when the question is, what is the only miracle of Jesus that is recorded in all 4 Gospels, you will say, see, and you can thank me later. All right. So, So I think the fact that fact is significant. That there was something about this that God wanted us to know, that he made sure something impactful, something significant, that was the miracle that we find in all 4 Gospels. So it's worth looking at, and that's why it stood out in, again, like in this study of Luke, we cannot cover everything, and it would take, a full year, and nobody wants a sermon series that lasts a year. But this stuck out to me because of that fact. All the 4 Gospels. But we're going to be looking at Luke's account, and it's in chapter 9, and it's going to start at verse 10. But before we do that, I want us to look at a couple things that have happened leading up to this point. So at the very beginning of Luke chapter 9, Jesus and this is something we don't hear a lot about, we don't talk a lot about, it kind of gets overlooked, but Jesus sends out his 12 disciples, his 12 apostles. He sends them out on their own, like on a short-term mission trip, if you would. They're to go out to preach and to heal and to be out with the people without Jesus there. And so he sends them out at the beginning of chapter 9, and the other Gospels give that same account. He sends them out. I think it's Matthew that tells us they go out in twos, but either way, they're going out without Jesus. And that's something that has happened right before this, or shortly before this, and they are coming back to Jesus to report what they've done. and their experiences. And the other thing that has happened shortly before the feeding of the 5,000 is John the Baptist was beheaded. We knew he was in prison. We talked about a couple weeks ago that John is going, Jesus, are you really the one? Because I'm sitting here in prison. I don't understand if you're really the Messiah, or are we still waiting for somebody else? And so when he was beheaded by Herod. And so we've got these two things going on right before this happens. And it's funny how life does this sometimes. You know, we'll have a reason to celebrate, something good will happen, and so the disciples, they've gotten back, and they're just eager to tell Jesus all about their experiences and stuff. I don't know if you have a similar situation as a parent or as a grandparent, but for us anyway, there's this window right when you pick up the girls from school where they are just a mile a minute. They're going to tell you things that happened during the day, you know, and how their day at school was. They're going to tell you, you know, the things that happened that day. If you miss that window, like if you wait till you get home and ask, how was your day? Fine. Good. But if you hit that right window, you're going to hear all about what happened. And that's the moment these disciples have come back, and they can't wait to tell Jesus about, you know, the people that they've healed. The Bible says that they healed, they cast out demons, and they preached. They had this great experience that we don't really talk a lot about. We don't really know a lot about. But I just can imagine them going back eager to share with Jesus. And that's exciting. Jesus is proud of them, I'm sure. And he's excited to hear from them, I'm sure. But also weighing on his heart is his cousin, John the Baptist. This great prophet has been killed. And life does that to us sometimes, where in the middle of a celebration, we also have something that wants to bring us down. And we have to balance that out. A lot of times we can focus on the negative. We can focus on the reason to bring us down and let it steal the joy from what the reasons we have to rejoice. So that's kind of the context of what happened. And Jesus wants to get away alone with his disciples, with the 12. They're looking for a place to kind of get alone, maybe talk about what's happened to John the Baptist, but especially to talk about their experiences and just to get refreshed and recharged. And being with the people can, you know, I'm sure they could use some time away and to recharge and refresh and debrief. But the crowd finds out where they're at and follows them. And when Jesus sees them, again, it wasn't what his plan was, but he sees them and he has compassion on them. That they, in their need and their desperation, they've sought him out and they've followed him and they've found him. And so he begins to teach and minister to them and be with them. Even though it wasn't really what he had planned, he had compassion. And in his love and compassion, he spent time with the crowd. And then as the day goes on, we have this account, our account that the feeding of the 5,000. I'm just going to read it to you. If you would just kind of listen and follow along. I didn't put the story in its entirety up on the screen, but we're going to get to a couple of verses later on. But when the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds learned about it and followed him. He welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here." But Jesus replied, "You give them something to eat." And they answered, "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd." About 5,000 men were there. But he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." The disciples did so, and everybody sat down. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to set before the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So that's our story. That's the story of the feeding of the 5,000 people. An amazing story, a story that's included in all 4 Gospels. It's a story of God having compassion on the crowds and a miraculous account. So we're going to look at one question today, and that was, did Jesus really feed 5,000 people? So the answer is no. If we look back at the verse we said, verse 14, it says there was about 5,000 men there. In Matthew, it adds along with women and children. So Jesus didn't really feed 5,000 people. There's actually more people than that. There are 5,000 men. Now, we know Jesus had female followers. We know he had several that traveled and followed him around quite a bit. And even if he didn't have female disciples following him, I'm sure that the crowd contained women. So we're just going to do a little fun math. This isn't from the scripture. We're just going to speculate a little bit. Let's say there's 5,000 men. Let's say half of the men are married and had their wives with them. I mean, it's probably even more than that, but we're just going to kind of be conservative. Let's say half of the 5,000 men had their wives with them. So that gets us to 7,500 people. But what about the single women? There were single men there following Jesus, and there were probably single women too. So let's just add another 1,500 to get us to 9,000 people. Just for being conservative, there may have been more than that, but if there's 5,000 men, 2,500 of them were single, then let's just throw in another 1,500 single women. But what about children? So let's just using our same numbers, even though they're made up and speculated. Let's say if half of the married people had 2 kids with them. So we're somewhere at 11,500 people that really possibly could have been fed that day. So, and again, just speculation, just numbers, but did Jesus really feed 5,000 people? No, he fed maybe twice as much as that, maybe more than that. So, an incredible miracle. Our second question is the same as the first question. Did Jesus really feed 5,000 people? Did Jesus really feed 5,000 people? I was amazed. This was new to me. As I was studying this sermon this week, I discovered not just in one location, 2 different places I read, there is a belief about how this account went down that I did not realize was a thing. And there are these people that are suggesting that the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 was really a miracle of generosity. That what happened is the people were so moved by the generosity of, they just had this little bit of food, but they were attempting to feed all these people. And then somebody sitting in the crowd said, you know what? I've got some food here. I'll share mine too. And then somebody else said, well, I have some food here. And it was just a miracle of generosity. People were so inspired by seeing other people sacrificially give that they decided that they would sacrificially give. And so that is how the 5,000 plus got fed. It was a miracle of, and that would be inspiring. I mean, that would be a good story. I mean, it would motivate, sometimes we've seen people give and be inspired by how much they've given or how much they've sacrificed, and it can move us to do those same things. That would have been a great story. But if that was the great story, then why wasn't that the story that we read? I mean, there would have been nothing wrong with saying it that way if that's how it happened. There'd be nothing wrong with saying that that's how it happened. I actually mean a lot to say, oh, and it was so amazing. Jesus moved all these people, and they just started giving up their food. It was beautiful. There'd be nothing wrong with that story. But that's not the story I read in any of the 4 Gospels. This was a miracle. I think we are in dangerous territory when we start taking the supernatural away from God's Word. And we start whittling away at Jesus' supernatural power, at the ability to make miracles, and we're going to find ourselves with a faith in a human and not in the Son of God. So I think, did Jesus really feed 5,000 people? I think, yes, this was a miracle. This was him showing his divine power, divine authority. He has power over the laws of physics, the laws of nature, and he made 5 loaves and 2 fish last somehow, miraculously, to feed 5,000 plus people. Got a third question for you. It's the same as the first 2. Did Jesus really feed 5,000 people? I want to look again. We've got 2 verses I want us to look at. First one is verse 13. This is the disciples have come to Jesus and said, hey, we need to do something. We need to send these people away so they can get food because it's getting late. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat in verse 13. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And that's when they're like, all we got is 5 loaves and 2 fish. There's no way, we can feed this whole crowd. Then I want to skip down to verse 16. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to set before the people. I've heard this story countless times before. This clicked with me. And when it clicked with me, it has become one of my favorite parts of the New Testament. When it clicked that this miracle happened not in the hands of Jesus, this is the way I'm reading it, but in the hands of the 12. Jesus took the 5 loaves, there's still 5 loaves, there's still 2 fish. He takes it, he prays, and it's his power, it's his miraculous power that's about to be displayed. But the disciples were in charge of the distribution. God provided the miracle, but the disciples were in charge of the distribution. So at some point, and I don't know how it happened, I don't know at what point they explained it, but Peter, James, John, Andrew, they're in the crowd passing out this food, and at some point, it's not running out like it's supposed to be. And in their hands, the miracle happens. And that just amazes me that God, that Jesus allowed them to be a part of this, one of the greatest miracles that happened in their hands. And we give Jesus all the credit because obviously his is the power that allowed it to happen. But availability. They were available to help. And ability is important. But availability is essential. Being available to God for him to use you. The disciples were there and used by him. So we have to be willing to be used by God. His power can do far more than we can imagine, but we need to be his to use. And you may feel like you have few resources. Just 5 loaves and 2 fish was not very much, very inadequate. And sometimes we come and think that that's what we bring to the table is not much. What we bring to the table is inadequate, and how could possibly God use what we are bringing to the table to make a difference? But God specializes in multiplication. He specializes in taking our meager offerings, our humble offerings, and multiplying them for kingdom impact. The kingdom is all about multiplication. It's all about, it's in our weakness that he's made strong. It's in our vulnerability that he can work through us. When we open ourselves and admit that we're nothing without him, he can be everything. God provides for our needs, and he gives in abundance. They're basketfuls of leftovers. When we trust God for our needs, we will end up with basketful of abundance of blessings. But really what I want to leave with you, and I wasn't sure my first go at the annual meeting thing, I wasn't sure how much time I had. So if this is short and sweet, it is kind of short and sweet. But I want to leave you with just the thought that we can be the hands that feed. This miracle of feeding the 5,000 people. Did Jesus feed the 5,000? Well, the disciples fed the 5,000. So the answer is yes and yes. So what can he do with us? Right. Father God, just thank you so much for being the kind of God that wants us to be a part of your miracle, part of your story. You didn't have to do it that way. You didn't have to give us the privilege of serving you, of being a part of your kingdom, but you did. That's how you chose. You chose to win the world through us, through ordinary people with all our faults, all the mistakes we make, all our weaknesses, our meager offerings. You said, that's what I want to use to win the world. Those are the people, these imperfect people, these people that, that they mess things up, they worry, they have fears, they have doubts, they have temptations. Those are the people that I want to use to win this world. I want to love through them. I want to take care, I want to feed the hungry through them. I want to take care of the sick and the lonely through them. I want to introduce the world to the saving grace of Jesus Christ through them. I want the miracle to happen in their